10 a.m., so I think we'll go ahead and get started here. So first of all, I'm Sean Maxwell. I chair the Induced Seismicity Technical Committee for the American Rock Mechanics Association, ARMA. And with Jens Lund-Sneed and Madi Haddad, we'd like to welcome you to our monthly webinar series. And today we're very pleased and keen to hear from Jake Walter with the Oklahoma Geological Survey. Jake's going to be talking about some of his work, seismic monitoring, and some of the lessons learned from fracking in Oklahoma. So just before we get to Jake in the main event, we have just a couple of housekeeping items here that we want to go through, and then we'll get into the main event with Jake. So I'll pass it over to Jens and talk about the upcoming schedule. Jens?
Yeah, hi everyone. So after Jake, as you know, we're doing the first these webinars on the first Friday of each month, and so we have two of them lined up after this. Ivan Wong from Lettuce Consultants is going to be talking about what used to be called the States First Initiative, coming up on the 5th of March, same time, 10 a.m. Central. So that I think would be of interest to a lot of people. And then a month after that, Eric Dunham at Stanford is talking about some new modeling that he and his students and postdocs have been doing related to a seismic slip associated with fluid injection. So that one is the first Friday of the month, but note that it's at a slightly different time, 1 hour later, 11 a.m. Central. And we're currently talking about how to do the summer scheduling and how to continue these webinars as the current kind of ban on conferences continues. So, as case counts stay high. So, let us know what your thoughts are, and I'm sure we'll have some information for you all soon.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for another great webinar. This is Madi Haddad at the Bureau of Economic Geology. We would like to highlight some general guidelines for this webinar. So the organizing committee decided to change this guideline a little bit. So if you receive this webinar invite and would like to share it with others, please do so, because we would like to have more outreach of these webinars. But for the following webinars, that would be great if you send the interested parties to us, Jens, Sean, and me, the organizing committee. And everyone will be muted during the talk for better flow of this webinar. And please submit your question during or after the talk in the chat button right in the middle of the screen at the bottom to let us know about your questions. Sometimes we need to paraphrase these questions to use the time better. And please send these questions to everyone. And also, we made a YouTube channel for Induced Seismicity Technical Committee, and we upload the webinars that are allowed by the author or the presenter to us to record. So please subscribe to this channel to receive notifications for future uploads. And the link to this YouTube channel is inside the invitation email. Without further delay, let's invite Jake to start his talk. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for the introduction and for the organizing this series. It's actually been one of the few highlights of these COVID times that we're all living through. So thanks for putting in that work to get these exciting panels of speakers. And I'm also very humbled to be included amongst such a esteemed company. So thank you guys. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about some of the hydraulic fracturing issues that we've been chasing as a state agency at OGS, operating as a state agency in addition to sort of our role in sort of researching this phenomena. And I just want to sort of point out the contributions of all my team at OGS: Paul Aguari, Fernando Ferrer, Andrew Teal, and Isaac Wolfel. as well as some of the research contributions from Jiawei Chen. We're building off of, standing on the shoulders, of a lot of efforts in the past too, to sort of programmatically build up the expertise at the Oklahoma Geological Survey towards understanding some of these myriad induced seismicity issues. So Oklahoma, I think, is more famous or infamous for the drastic rise in the seismicity over the last decade, typically associated with wastewater disposal. So if we look at the sort of historical record, we go back to 2010, and seismicity related to wastewater injection disposal practices probably began before that. Although in the early ages of the early sort of versions of the earthquake site monitoring network, in addition to issues with reporting, it's hard to sort of track back when wastewater induced seismicity actually began. Sue Huff and others think that possibly it began in the 1950s or even earlier, but that's a topic for another time. So what we observed was a sort of threefold increase in the wastewater disposal, specifically into the Arbuckle Formation, which lies above crystalline basement rocks. Coupled with that increase in wastewater disposal, we saw a broad increase in the frequency of smaller earthquakes. And as we've come out of that peak in 2014, 2015 in disposal, we've also seen a dramatic decrease in wastewater disposal, and synchronous with that, a dramatic decrease in the seismicity of these smaller earthquakes. So it's not just the smaller earthquakes, obviously, but the earthquakes, the rare larger events that most impact humans. So coupled with that rise in seismicity was the sort of issues with potentially damaging and potentially life-threatening larger events, which did cause significant damage. So these are photos from the Prague earthquake in 2011. Damage associated with that. This steeple actually didn't fall. They had to knock it over because it was compromised, but you can see the damage in this homeowner's house. And so at OGS, our mission has been primarily geared towards chasing the data. So we operate a real-time seismic network consisting of upwards of 90 plus seismic stations in the state, including pulling seismic information from adjacent states, and also utilizing obviously the real-time streams for some stations that are operated by outside entities within Oklahoma. But we use a system to track the earthquakes in real time and to produce a catalog. So all the data that goes into our scientific products are available streaming in real time. We send this to IRIS for archival purposes, as well as USGS for some of their monitoring efforts. But these scientific products are available as soon as they're made and endorsed and sent out into the world. And you can go to our website, find maps. You can find a custom way to sort of download our catalog and sort of peruse those products. So we've made some considerable improvements over the years, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But one of those efforts that is not necessarily widely advertised is that OGS, since May of 2019, OGS actually became the authoritative network within the state of Oklahoma. And this was a big deal for us because it sort of provided the endorsement of sort of decades-long monitoring effort, but it also sort of cleared up some inconsistencies. Cleared up some inconsistencies between the OGS reporting and the USGS reporting of magnitudes, for example, which has some impacts, as you'll see when we discuss things like traffic light protocols for hydraulic fracturing.
So you're muted, Jake.
How long was I muted?
Oh, just a moment. You're good now.
Okay. So if you look at the earthquakes magnitude 3.0 per month through time, this is the same record I showed you earlier. And if you're looking at a regional sort of national level monitoring effort, this catalog is going to be consistent across the board, whether OGS is producing it or USGS might be producing it. But if we look at sort of all the earthquakes, we get into issues of catalog completeness. So I'm just showing this depiction here to show that the catalog completeness has changed dramatically in the last several years. So sort of towards the beginning of 2017, we switched our monitoring software to SeisComp3 previously was a sort of Python based monitoring system that operated in quasi real time. But we switched to SeisComp3, which improved sort of the QA/QC on data as it was coming in and improved our products. And then last year, we also implemented some machine learning picking ability into our network detection capabilities. So I'll talk about that just briefly. We produced an open source software package called EasyQuake, which takes Zach Ross's GPD machine learning, deep learning phase picker, and we combine that with a Python-based associator and to provide sort of a way to get fast and rapid machine learning driven earthquake solutions. So we're able to run this EasyQuake after the UTC day ends, and then that EasyQuake will actually produce a QuakeML formatted file per event, and we're able to drop that into our SeisComp3 monitoring software, and the analysts are then able to implement that into our routine catalog. So you can see an example of the efficacy of that algorithm. You see the SeisComp3 events. Obviously, we're able to detect very clearly with these more deterministic phase pickers, the larger events, but the EasyQuake sort of augments our ability to detect smaller and smaller events. And so we've observed a magnitude of completeness improvement of about 0.7 magnitude units. And just for the sort of visual people out here, here's an example of an event that was a magnitude 0.7 earthquake that we would have gone undetected if we didn't have EasyQuake augmenting our real-time system. So I think a lot in this audience would agree with the notion that we want to actually identify small earthquakes. And the reason we want to get down and drill down into identifying smaller and smaller events is that small earthquakes help us sort of validate or invalidate theories that we might have about stress in fault zones, for example. So obviously, you know, if you have a model that's providing a prediction of the stress field, you might want to understand which areas of the fault are seismogenic in response to that stress perturbation. So here's an example just from Kayla Kroll's paper in 2017 and Thomas Goebel's sort of, you know, modeling the poroelastic effect. And obviously you want to have some seismicity to sort of, you know, test some of these hypotheses about poroelastic stresses and pore pressure and, you know, stresses along faults and what creates earthquakes. Okay, so going back to the wastewater disposal issue. Now, when I go and I speak to groups around the state, which is one of our roles as a state agency, is disseminating that state-of-the-art information to stakeholders around the state, whether those are the legislators, whether that's teachers, whether that's different trade groups. You know, we talk a lot about this and use this figure as a prop from Justin Rubinstein's review paper. And it's useful because a lot of Oklahomans still will have a strong association with the rise in seismicity and damaging seismicity with hydraulic fracturing. So often asked, oh, it's the fracking, right? It's the fracking that does it. And it's like, well, no, you have to complain. You have to sort of explain that fracking is part of this life cycle of this type of hydrocarbon extraction from north central Oklahoma, but that the fracking is actually, just, happens right after the well is in place, and then that well is producing, and it's producing all this wastewater, which is a huge environmental issue. You dispose of it deep underground, but that creates broader regional issues because of the vast amounts of wastewater that needs to be disposed. So we typically gloss over the hydraulic fracturing angle. So, but I think we've learned, and we've sort of seen this decrease in seismicity from hydraulic fracturing, and that's because we've taken several mitigating steps. And this is an example of sort of the science really chasing after some of these solutions for effective regulation and effective practices. So we knew early on that a lot of high volume disposal was more likely to produce seismicity from Weingarten's paper. And proximity to faults is pretty important. So if you're actually disposing near critically stressed faults, if you know about those faults, that's a bad thing to do, and promotes seismicity on those critically stressed faults that are optimally oriented in the current stress direction. And we know that, pumping deep underground, and sometimes these wells were actually drilled into basement, completed into basement rocks. These basements, the faults are situated within the crystalline basement, and that's a direct, connection to the basement. That's not a good thing. We've learned that rapid shut-in can reduce aftershock activity. So one of the mitigating steps that the OCC takes after a large event is they will rapidly shut in wells. And Thomas Goebel showed that the aftershock activity is reduced after that happens, after an action is taken, which is promising for sort of rapid mitigation, sort of scenarios. And finally, there's a long-term regional reduction in wastewater disposal driven by the market and also driven by regulatory factors. The OCC stepping in and providing that radar gun, that disincentive to have very large volume disposal wells. So I think in a lot of ways that this is starting to be obviously something for intense study, but also a success story as we continue to see the seismic hazard reduced. Now, come along shortly after I started at Oklahoma Geological Survey in late 2016, the OCC wanted to be more proactive about hydraulic fracture induced seismicity. And this was sort of, I think, brought to the fore because of a number of things. For one, Austin Holland had a very early paper linking hydraulic fracturing with seismicity in south central Oklahoma. This paper in 2013 showed that you could have hydraulic fracture triggered earthquakes several kilometers away from the wellbore. So that's important, that you're several kilometers away from this wellbore. And so there's something about the Oklahoma geology that may perhaps allows seismicity to occur several kilometers from a wellbore. But that's not inconsistent with other sort of case studies in other regions around the US and Canada. And also Rob Skolmel had, while the paper didn't come out until 2018, Rob Skolmel had been presenting and sharing with OCC in particular that he was finding that, hydraulic fracture triggered earthquakes were actually a lot more common than was realized. This is in part due to the frac focus and completeness of that data set, and obviously not having that data in real time when these earthquakes are occurring makes it difficult for regulators to respond, effectively to some of these issues. But Rob Skolmel showed that seismicity from hydraulic fracturing was relatively common. And also around that time, there was a sort of renewed, emphasis on the scoop stack plays. So when we talk about wastewater disposal induced seismicity, most of that occurred associated with the Mississippi Lime area and also the Hunton dewatering area, which is just south of Mississippi Lime. And sort of west of Oklahoma City, you have these plays called the Stack up in the north and then the Scoop south of Oklahoma City. And so modeling after some regulatory programs in Canada, the OCC, and with guidance from their consultant, Julie Shemeta, OCC put together a traffic light protocol in order to deal with sort of rising magnitudes during completions. And I'm not going to go into great detail about the stoplight protocol. Just wanted to note here that this original protocol had a red light at 3.5, a yellow light at 3.0, and a green light at 2.5. Those magnitudes have come down a little bit, and there's different actions on this revision that I won't go into, again, incredible detail, but just know that the stoplight protocol is sort of pegged at, a red light is still, a dark red light is still at 3.5, but actually they are taking red light actions around a magnitude 3.0 at the moment. And before I really tease into a lot of the sort of discussion between OCC and OGS, I want to have a little bit of a disclaimer before I get myself into too much trouble. OGS is the technical effort for the state to monitor seismicity in real time and deliver that information to all our stakeholders. OCC is the regulatory authority. So OCC has the power to make directives that affect oil and gas. They are directly in contact with oil and gas operators when they reach certain thresholds on their stoplight protocol. And OCC sometimes will ask for our technical guidance on earthquake-related issues related to hydraulic fracturing, but there's definitely a firewall between the agencies, and you can maybe speculate why that might be important, but I just want to put that note in there before I progress any further. So OCC is, along with that stoplight protocol, they announced what they call a FRAC notice. So FRAC notice is their program that requires operators to provide OCC with at least 48 hours notice of impending completion and the intended duration, including number of stages and volumes. Now, I underline intended duration because sometimes these are submitted several weeks away, and the number of stages and volumes, while the number of stages probably doesn't change, the volumes are going to change, I think, dependent upon who's completing that well. So that's the data that we have for the completions, which, if you are familiar with working in other areas or seen some of these talks in the series, you can already understand that that's going to be a very incomplete data set for understanding whether or not a frac is making an earthquake, for example. So OCC also handles all the policing, so to speak. So we provide our data products in real time, and they ingest those products, and they have their own spatial temporal association that they use, that they have found useful, and that they apply when they sort of decide which operators to contact and at what point do they contact those operators. Now there's, just speaking anecdotally, there is a good working relationship between operators and the Corporation Commission in a lot of circumstances. So a lot of times OCC might know about seismicity before the OGS is able to detect it, for example, for those lower magnitudes. And we expanded our network operations into Western and Southwestern Oklahoma in order to sort of be responsive to the FRAC notice protocol and the sort of anticipated expansion into the Scoop Stack area for completing wells. So we had our network up and running with pretty decent capability, although I already showed you that we've since improved our magnitude of completeness since 2017. And like I said before, we participate in technical conferences or when sort of asked, but we don't actively decide on any kind of policy action or any sort of specific action that the OCC would take. We provide them with what the science might dictate, but it's somewhat limited in that aspect. And then in addition, while there's several different private networks that operate within the area, we don't have access to any of the real-time private network data. So any kind of real-time decision is impacted by that. So let's take a sort of broad bird's eye look at sort of looking at this data set. So this is combining, again, two simple catalogs. We just have the frac notice, completions, the timing of the completion, the anticipated end of the completion, and some of those other sort of untrustworthy sort of data points. But if we track sort of the completions per month, and this is the black line here, you can see that at a peak, we were somewhere around 165 or so completions in late 2018, early 2019. So 160 wells across the state we're completing. And if we look at sort of the pink line here, these are completions that are associated with any kind of earthquake. So we run a very simple sort of detection on sort of where we might see an earthquake within a certain window in space and time. And for the purposes of this plot, we just very simply said within 5 kilometers and within 20 days of the start of a completion, if you, so imagine you're taking every single frac and you're drawing a circle around it with 5 kilometers and 20 days after the start of that frac, you're saying, okay, here's a detection. Here's a frac that is associated with an event. So you can see that this broad trend sort of mimics both these data points. I want to note also that the pink y-axis corresponds to the right-hand side. So it's not like we have more completions with an earthquake than we do have completions that month. The corresponding axis for the magenta or pink line is on the right-hand side. And then obviously the reds correspond with the reds. So for the most part, we do see a broad sort of increase in completions when we have more completions, but it's not always the larger magnitudes that are typically associated with earthquakes. So magnitude 2.0 or greater, which is usually in practice, it's usually felt if it's not too rural, an area in Oklahoma. So we see these felt earthquakes pretty commonly associated with some of these completions. So we wanted to sort of get a better sort of kernel for identifying when these earthquakes are associated with a completion. And so we do a kernel density estimate, and this time just looking at the sort of the spatial density. This is an example of adding all the sort of initially triggered earthquakes. So taking a catalog of the seismicity now within 10 kilometers and something like 20 days and adding it on top of each other. So if I showed you the raw data, this would just be like a shotgun blast of a number of different earthquake points. The data have been rotated so that this is the very end of a well, of a completed well. So this is the toe of the well. This would be the sort of the surface hole, latitude, longitude, and this is the bottom hole, latitude, longitude. And they're two different sizes because in Oklahoma, typically hydraulic fracture wells were 1 mile long laterals until a few years ago when the statute changed and you could have 2 mile long laterals. So that's just showing you that this is about 1 mile long and this is a 2 mile long lateral. But a lot of the seismicity is close to the toe, which suggests that as the hydraulic fracs are starting, that they're producing seismicity towards the start of these stages, and also at sort of the toe of these horizontals. So, and then when we try to sort of piece together, okay, what's the relevant sort of time window in which to identify HF related seismicity, we find something befuddling about the frac notice catalog in that a lot of the entries are suggesting that a frac is occurring just during one day, or it's actually taking exactly 7 days. And so we viewed this with a little bit of skepticism. And then, rather than sort of take the sort of frac duration, we wanted to actually look at sort of the empirical evidence for what is the relevant sort of duration for seismicity to be associated with these frac wells. So we make a sort of plot like this, where we're looking at now the sort of radial distance from the end of that hole, and we're looking at then most of the data sort of collapses pretty surprisingly fairly close to that bottom hole location, but that we can observe seismicity sometimes 20, 30 days out using this crude association. So again, we're basically conducting an exercise where we're trying to use these different thresholds and trying to identify where the data empirically falls out. And so to take a sort of conservative approach, because we're not so much interested in identifying and pinpointing, and blaming specific fracs for specific earthquakes, we want to understand hydraulic fracturing and seismicity itself. So as a conservative estimate, we just take 4 kilometers and 20 days since the start of a frac, look at sort of seismicity relative to that bottom hole location in the frac within those sort of windows, and try to understand that a little bit better. So returning to that sort of spatial view of where most of the data falls out. So take a look at this plot, and you can see that most of the data, again, is near that toe here. But there's the added issue that in Oklahoma, a lot of the operations are taking place pretty close from one another. So on the right-hand side, you can see within a 10-kilometer window, you can see a pad has several horizontals coming out of it. There's a sort of pattern of seismicity that would be associated within 5 kilometers and within that sort of 20-day time window. But the question, you start to ask yourself the question, okay, well, obviously from a regional network, some of these horizontals locations are going to have horizontal errors on the order of 1 kilometer at least. So combine that with the fact that you do have simultaneous operations in some cases. Usually they're not incredibly simultaneous, but sometimes you have seismicity that might be associated with an earlier cluster over here associated with this particular horizontal. So in order to sort of deal with that data problem in a maybe a simple way, a simplification, we decided to actually apply some statistics to some of these populations. So one of the insights that Cliff Froelich had, and I know many of you are familiar with Cliff Froelich's work on induced seismicity in general and Texas induced seismicity in particular, but Cliff also has is one of the world's experts on deep earthquakes. And one of the nice things about, or not nice things, but issues about deep earthquakes is they are catalogs which contain very few events. So if you want to start to understand the statistics of deep earthquakes, you're dealing with events that have very small catalogs. And I think this is particularly suited for our issue of trying to look at whether different populations of earthquakes are related to one another or are subject to sort of outside influences. So what we've done is we take these spatial windows around a suspected associated hydraulic frac, and we try to just combine the seismicity in that spatial window 100 days prior and 100 days after, just for this illustrative case. So, and basically what you're testing against is you're saying that if my frac, stepping back in Cliff's work, he asked the question, okay, if you have a particular event that you're interested in, you're calling this event your main shock. Now, based on the inter-event timing of the seismicity previous to your main shock, what's the chance that your next event, and obviously when the next event is because you have that sequence, you have that catalog, what's the chance that this event is associated with that event? In that, can you test the occurrence of this event against a random Poissonian process that just continues in time? So in a way, you're looking for the rate prior to the frac starting, how we've applied it, is you're looking at the rate prior to the frac starting and trying to test against whether there's an increase in that rate that wasn't there previously. So this is a good example of that sort of null test here. So we have around a suspected or a candidate HF, so that's possibly producing seismicity. At time zero, the frac starts, and we see seismicity immediately after the frac. However, if we go back in time and we examine sort of the rate prior to that, it looks like there's some sort of continuation of whatever was going on here. Now, this could be, I'll get to it in a moment, this could be the influence of other types of HF associated activity. It could be the influence of wastewater disposal induced seismicity. But this would be a null test. So we can say, well, yeah, there's seismicity. It would have, like, in a very simple spatial and temporal association, it would have triggered us to look at it, but it's actually possibly not associated with that particular frac that occurred at time zero. So in a way, we're considering that perhaps this frac is an earthquake or something that's imparting energy into the system, and we're seeing whether that is actually going to be responsive to that time zero event. So next, what does this look like? So when we combine our earthquake catalog with that sort of the spatial temporal threshold, also with the sort of Poissonian testing against the Poissonian null hypothesis, we find HF associated activity pretty widespread across Oklahoma. I just want to point out that the color bar goes from 2017 to the middle of, or actually it ends sometime late last year, but you can see pretty uniquely is that there's scoop stack related HF seismicity, hydraulic fracture associated seismicity across the scoop stack, which is exactly what we would have thought. But in addition, there's other sort of seismicity associated with hydraulic fracturing in eastern Oklahoma, which is consistent with Rob Skomel's analysis from an earlier data set. But the black events are actually the pre-2017 data set. So in order to sort of reach back further into Oklahoma's history, we actually combine the frac, instead of using the frac notice, we can use the frac focus data set, and we can use our earthquake catalog that we generate. And so what we find is that we actually identify several circumstances within what we would typically call the wastewater injection or wastewater disposal area of interest. We find a lot of seismicity associated with hydraulic fracturing. Now, in addition, when we start thinking about stoplight protocols or traffic light protocols for mitigating HF-related seismicity, we find a number of these events are being felt by humans. So let's and this is basically just cross-referencing that event information with the USGS Did You Feel It database, which itself is probably incomplete because it's obviously, it's likely that some seismicity could be felt, but go unreported with USGS Did You Feel It. But these are just events that are confirmed with a USGS Did You Feel It report. So when we look at the magnitudes involved, it's no surprise perhaps that the largest events are being felt more commonly, and a lot of the smaller events are not being felt. But if we think about sort of earthquakes and hydraulic fracturing events as sort of a nuisance level event or seismicity, it's perhaps surprising that people are feeling and reported as feeling earthquakes that are below magnitude 2.0. Although this isn't very common, but it's still kind of surprising to me. Now, when we compare now we look at the sort of maximum Did You Feel It reports from this Did You Feel It data set. We find, so this is now taking all these red reports, these event reports, examining what people reported feeling in the sort of modified Mercalli intensity. And if you're close to some of these larger events, magnitude 3.6, for example, one of the largest events that we've so far correlated, This is approaching what would be sort of in the intensity factor as a light damage threshold. So even though these are magnitude 3.6, 3.4, and lower 3.0 threshold, the did you feel it reports are pretty high. And once you get into magnitude 5 or sorry, intensity 5 or 6, you actually reach the threshold of plaster cracking and slight cosmetic damage from some of these events. So we'll get back to the sort of how that might inform your stoplight protocol. Now, when we look at sort of what the intensity prediction equations for North America, you can feed in the magnitude and the relevant distances you are away from an earthquake of a particular size. We find that in general the feel-its are elevated, categorically more elevated than what the intensity prediction equations would suggest. So we'll dig into that a little bit in a second, but out of 5,400 completions in Oklahoma since October 2016, we find actually quite a bit, 9% are associated with an earthquake of any size. So a year and a half ago, that was a much smaller number, down in the 3%, 4%. But because of the implementation of EasyQuake, even though the number of completions has gone down significantly, we're able to detect more and more seismicity with individual fracs. So this is not a very significant number, but it's still a small percent of actual completions are producing a regionally detected event. Finally, 194 were associated with a felt event, or about 4% of those. And obviously, any kind of analysis like this would be, improved with better completion data. So digging into the sort of the did you feel it and the human aspect of extractive technologies in general. So one thing that's recently cropped up is we had a member of the public reach out to us because there's a drilling rig near his home, and he was feeling these anomalous vibrations because of, I don't know if there was compressors or what going on, but that this well wasn't actually being fracked. It was just the vibrations were causing him and his family to lose significant sleep. And in addition, obviously, we've encountered some red light events, which prompted an OCC response to and required the operator to sort of pause operations. So we wanted to sort of better understand why perhaps humans are perceiving these frac earthquakes differently than other earthquakes in north central Oklahoma. And one of the sort of projects that we've engaged is trying to better disentangle these did you feel it reports. So this is an example now, just looking at sort of spatial areas. In the red box, we have these red data points here. And in the gray box, this is earthquakes sources from this zone here in north central Oklahoma. When we compare, we generally see that there's somewhat of a subtle trend of increasing intensity reports for earthquakes that we've generally associated with hydraulic fracturing. When we look at the instrumental records, now we don't have very many accelerometers, but obviously you can get acceleration from a seismograph. We don't see actually a substantial difference between the instrumental records for these two sort of subcatalogs of events. So why is there that sort of discrepancy? Well, my colleague Paul Aguari has been looking into exactly that question. So Paul recently put together a longer version of what I'll show you. I'll just show you a few slides from his recent work, but he recently gave a risk webinar. This is the Regional Induced Seismicity Collaborative that's hosted at the Bureau of Economic Geology at University of Texas. The talks are recorded, so if you're interested, you could go find his talk at this website or email us, and we can point you to that information. But what we found was actually when we looked at these different regions in great detail, and this is actually a tried and true way of doing science, is actually look at your data, look at your raw data. And so what we found too was that some of the analysts were actually observing some very elongated ground motions from some of these regions that are specifically where hydraulic fracture earthquakes are associated with hydraulic fractures. And so Paul's been chasing this idea of these twin earthquakes. And so we observed both these different kind of weird classes of earthquakes. So two earthquakes occurring close in time and space, and also multi-phased events. So when an earthquake occurs above the basement, it appears that there's a reflection effect where the downward wave will actually reflect or refract off of that impedance contrast and create these elongated ground motions. So Paul has been, painstakingly going through and trying to catalog why these twins occur. Obviously, if you have two earthquakes occurring close in time and space, their coda are going to overlap substantially enough that it will make it very difficult for an analyst to actually identify that there's two events. So we think this is actually pretty common, and you can think about sort of an earthquake physics reason why you might create two events closely spaced in time. But we've identified these twin events, and also we've tried to disentangle these clusters within these clusters of events, try to disentangle why some of these events are also appearing as twins. But when you actually do some cross correlation on the individual waveforms, you find that they're actually, closely similar, closely enough that they're actually these sort of refracted events coming, bouncing off the basement impedance contrast. So put that all together, and what Paul's finding is that these events, these special classes of events, these twins and these multi-phased events, which again are closely related to these HF. It's not that every time there's an HF associated earthquake that we observe it as a twin or a multi-phased event, but these are most common from these HF associated events. A lot of these events have these elongated durations, which, if you think about it, it might be why we are observing this increased perception of intensity. Now, that's something that's definitely something that's very much a work in progress, and hopefully Paul will have that paper out to the public soon. So back thinking about, okay, so we've sort of tracked through the occurrence of HF associated activity, which is probably a lot more common than we originally thought. We've discussed some of the sort of human aspects and the shaking. Did you feel it? Back to thinking about sort of, the roles of state agencies and regulatory agencies in this whole process. So with hydraulic fracturing, the injection, the event occurs over a matter of days or hours, and mitigation seems to be effective on the order of hours or days. So when there's been pauses, in most cases, the operator is able to go back and either recomplete that or finish completing that well, or they'll just skip several stages, and they're successfully able to complete the rest of the stages in the horizontal, or they just might stop completing it, and go to switch to a different lateral that's closely located to that particular pause. When we think about wastewater injection, the injection went on for decades prior, ramped up in the last several years, or several years leading up to 2013, 2014, but the mitigation has been ongoing now for almost the last decade. So combine that with Thomas Goebel's suggestion that rapid mitigation can be successful in rapidly reducing the hazard by some amount that is yet to be quantified. I think there's promising sort of approaches to mitigation efforts on both of these fronts. But an emerging issue that we've been identifying, or slow to identify, is what happens when you have hydraulic fracturing, which is producing a large, widely felt event, combined with a wastewater disposal nearby. So this is an example of a magnitude 3.6, or sorry, 3.4 that was triggered in 2019, and it produced seismicity and aftershock seismicity going on several weeks. Now, it was sort of befuddling because in a lot of circumstances, the HF seismicity declines fairly rapidly. But upon further investigation, there was a suggestion that there was an influence from a nearby disposal well that was disposing into adjacent, not quite the completion interval or a completion formation, but into an adjacent formation. And so this disposal well had been operating for a year and a half prior to the observance or the occurrence of seismicity associated with hydraulic fracturing. But as I sort of demonstrated earlier, and you can see right here, in Oklahoma, there's a lot of closely spaced oil and gas real estate. I mean, look at all these hydraulic fracturing wells, these horizontal wells that are, have just been completed in the last 3 or 4 years. And then in addition, there's all these existing production wells. So the red dots and the green dots are existing production wells prior to 2017. So you can see there's a lot of operations going on in very limited space. So what's yet to be seen is sort of approaches to mitigating and identifying causal issues, because the best way to mitigate is to know what's causing, the issue that you're observing. And it can be somewhat complicated in areas like Oklahoma and other sort of oil and gas producing areas. In addition, are there any causal factors for hydraulic fracturing? So are there any best practices that could be sort of implemented from a sort of public perspective to reduce the chance of having HF-associated seismicity? So Rosamil Rees published an article recently looking at some of these causal factors, and there doesn't seem to be any kind of real association with increasing volumes having a larger chance of seismicity, at least in the scoop stack areas, or really the Arkoma Basin, excuse me. Now, recently, Swadal Patel, a recently graduated student from OU, looked at 3D attributes from this study area west of Oklahoma City, and he did identify several basement features that were through going into the stratigraphic column, where several companies are targeting completions, targeting wells and targeting completions. And so we do find that in some cases, these basement features from, again, these are curvature basement reflection features. You can see that in some cases, these are actually delineating what are clear faults. So it's possible that 3D seismic provides a pathway for avoiding, just like we discussed with wastewater injection induced seismicity. Some of these structures are present, and it's possible that they could be present prior to a planned completion. So this is that the beach balls are seismicity, the red is seismicity without focal mechanisms, and then there's a clear feature here, which is an interpreted fault from that basement attributes. And you can see this place is just riddled with faults. But obviously, the question is where are the faults, and where are the seismogenic faults, and where are the aseismic faults? Where is it safe to complete? That's an open question, obviously. So, just modeled after that earlier slide from discussing wastewater disposal induced seismicity, doesn't seem to be a clear dependence on volume. There are seismogenic structures visible. The traffic light, it seems to be successful. I mean, so one of the things that we've anecdotally been hearing from operators is that they'll use very dense monitoring, private monitoring, and they'll actually peg their stoplight protocol at least 1 magnitude unit below the regulatory one. And this is I think there's some literature to the effect that if you have dense enough monitoring, you can anticipate an increase in the frequency and magnitudes of microseismicity leading up to larger regionally felt events. but we just don't have that capability right now, at least technologically. And I think, it's been somewhat of a success story that we haven't had any damaging HF-associated earthquakes thus far. So one of the interesting avenues that we're excited to pursue is a scenario where you could leverage the storage capability of some of these reservoirs in Oklahoma. So if you consider that the carbon dioxide emissions are on the order of 40 gigatons CO2 per year in the world, and that's about 5 gigatons of CO2 in the US per year. So if you actually densify that into liquid and spread it over the surface area of the United States, it's about a foot deep of CO2 that we're putting into the atmosphere every year. So obviously any kind of emissions reduction scenarios are not going to fully cut it, and we need to take an approach to actual capturing that CO2 and storing it deep underground for long-term storage, geologically long-term storage. And so we discussed some of these issues at OGS and invited some of our international colleagues through an NSF-funded workshop recently. And one of the interesting things to come out of that workshop, and you can read the white paper report on some of the technology and discussions about that. But one of the strong sort of suggestions was a need for understanding the risks associated with this long-term storage. So there needs to be a sort of clear need for an equitable and just transition, and that means sort of making sure that there are entities that keep the public trust. They hold the public trust and they keep the public trust. Now, I might be biased in saying that I think a state geological survey is something that's going to be around a long time, and hopefully we can work to continue to build up the public's trust in sort of our operations. But that doesn't mean that we give up on sort of the engineering challenges and the scientific challenges to have effective sort of and proven ways to mitigate damaging seismicity. But there also needs to be a human angle, a science communication angle, and a dialogue with the public. And I think you can't do that with just academics alone. You need local and regional sort of agencies and regulators that are going to engage with the public. So I guess I'll just stop there and respond to any questions there are.
Excellent. Well, thanks for the fantastic talk, Jake. A lot of really interesting information packed into that. So we typically book this for an hour, and there's maybe a few minutes left in that hour. There's quite a few questions on the chat window. There's a lot of kind of the question of rapid shutdown kind of initiated an interesting dialogue in terms of measuring pressure between Jerry Boak and Kevin Burns, leading to Andy Barber suggesting that he's got some pressure, looking for a place to install some pressure meters, but pressure transducers. But all of that was kind of kicked off by, I think, an interesting question from Michelle Gaucher from the British Columbia Oil and Gas Commission. So she was commenting on your statement of rapid shutdown on injection well. And she was noting in BC, rapid shutdown, I think she probably means instantaneous shutdown of the injection can cause a water hammer effect and cause induced seismicity just from the water hammer. Any comments on that, Jake, or maybe distinguishing instantaneous from rapid shut-in?
Yeah, I think so. So when I'm relaying the findings of Thomas Goebel's paper where they looked at sort of rapid, after an earthquake, a larger event in the wastewater disposal area of interest, the OCC required operators to shut in within a certain distance of that suspected or that main shock. And so that might impact a couple wells or 2 wells, and then there was a growing sort of reduction. So like if you're further away, you might be required to reduce to like 50% of disposal capacity. And so a lot of times that wasn't like immediate. It was maybe several days before that was passed on. And we looked at sort of the aftershock efficiency reduction in the subsequent, several, months after that. So we're looking at the aftershock efficiency reduction relative to other events of similar magnitudes where there was no mitigating action taken. Now I know that there's some Paul Siegel and others have suggested that there's a poor elastic effect for rapid shut-in that would actually increase seismicity, but it's not something that we've empirically really examined or observed in a lot of cases. Although there is some anecdotal evidence that rapid pauses and startups or starting injection can lead to seismicity, but we really haven't studied that in great detail, at least in Oklahoma.
Great. Well, maybe what we can do is pose kind of the formal part of this. We can go through more of the questions, Jake, if you have a few minutes. But just to wrap up kind of the formal part of the webinar, I guess on behalf of ARMA, Jake, I'd like to thank you for the excellent presentation. Thank all the participants for dialing in, continuing showing interest in the webinar series. And just a reminder to everyone, the next webinar is going to be Ivan Wong talking about the States First initiative. So that'll be March 5th, and watch for the invitation coming from Maddie on that. So I hear a virtual round of applause, Jake, for your excellent presentation. And thank you, everyone. And feel free to, I think Jake said he can stick around for a little bit longer and answer some of these more detailed questions.
Yep, thanks for listening, everyone. And I'll stick around for a little bit.
So Jake, I guess before getting to the detailed questions, I'll maybe invoke executive privilege and ask the first one myself. So a lot of kind of really intriguing comments you made, but one that really kind of stuck out to me, your observation when you did the rotation about the toe of the well, and with the seismicity sort of concentrating off the toe of the well. I wonder if that might be a kind of a purposeful correlation. So I know for my company, for instance, if we can, we prefer to drill the well if we know there's either faulting or, more importantly, a fault with seismic hazard, to drill toe in with the idea that we can frack away from the fault and get away from it if we run into problems, as well as potentially avoid drilling problems associated with the fault structure itself. So I guess more of a comment, but it's an interesting observation that it's obviously showing up statistically through multiple well bores.
Yeah, that's an interesting sort of commentary, and I might follow up with you about that, because there, it's hard to. I guess I also tend to be a little bit reserved about making any kind of drawing any conclusions from I mean, you saw when we were plotting the epicentral locations, there's a pretty significant scatter horizontally. So if that's truly falls out of the data, that's interesting, but it could also just be sort of randomness. I don't know.
Yeah, regardless, kind of an interesting observation, I think.
Yeah, actually, that's a nice segue
for sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Ryan. I was just about to read your questions. So
yeah, that's a nice segue for exactly what I wanted to ask. Is how robust of an observation do you think that was? Have you done much sensitivity tests, like filtering it even just by magnitude or most well located events, to see if it like persists or how it changes?
You mean just the scatter of the?
Yeah, like that time distance histogram you had.
Yeah, it's pretty. I mean, so you can look at sort of different ways. So we plotted the data so that we're only selecting the sort of north oriented wells versus the south oriented wells, and it pretty consistently still seems like it's right near the toe is like where most of the seismicity collapses. you know, and I'm pretty confident that our horizontal locations, at least since middle of 2017, are on the order of half a kilometer, you know, within half a kilometer, you know, air bar. But, you know, my colleague, Paul Aguirre, is also conducting some tests using 3D velocity model for the area derived from earthquake tomography. So we're trying to sort of make some improvements on not just obviously the research aspect of going back in time and learning from these data sets that we've collected, these rich data sets, but also trying to, you know, put that into some of our real-time earthquake location estimates.
Cool, thanks, Jake.
So Jake, there is also a question, and to the participants sticking around, feel free to unmute yourself if you want to sort of continue with some of these questions. But Doug Cook was asking about velocity model, and I guess I'll expand on his question a little bit, Jake. He's just wondering about kind of the detail of the velocity model that you're using, but maybe as a segue to that and kind of building on Ryan's question, what do you think in terms of your depth accuracy for the array? And you know, there's a lot of discussion, obviously, the activity association with the basement. I guess any comments?
Yeah, well, I purposely left that type of slide out, but no. So it's there's a kind of several part answer to this. The first is that we've publicized our velocity model. I'm happy to share that or point people to those resources, but we basically utilize for consistency the same velocity model that's been in place for at least the last 6 or 7 years. And that's derived from well logs in an area of sort of north or central Oklahoma. So obviously when you go west to the Anadarko Basin, where you have, you know, it deepens significantly, where that basement interface is, it deepens significantly versus, you know, going, you know, to eastern Oklahoma, where the bedrock geology is varied, sort of, you know, alters things. So there's been some discussion about using, you know, more local dense networks to verify earthquake locations relative to what we're kind of constrained with when we're using regional networks, which most of that ray path, once it gets to the station, might be traveling through basement. And so we do definitely see some systematic differences in earthquake locations. It has the effect of, in a lot of cases, I think, deepening our reported catalog events relative to reality, but we continue to use that for consistency's sake. Like I said, Paul is starting an effort to actually, you know, explore how well we can implement a 3D velocity model into our routine locations. And obviously, as part of that exercise, you want to, you know, look at, you know, the past. So we hope to have some better, more concrete answers than that in the future.
Good, thanks for that.
Yep.
And maybe continuing on, and again, anyone feel free to unmute yourself if you want to add to these questions. Partha Mandel is asking about recommendations for mitigation when you reach magnitude 2. So I guess when you reach traffic light level, thoughts on how best to mitigate?
Yeah, well, I feel like Sean, you're better prepared to answer that question. No, well, from a regional, I guess, you know, earthquake network perspective, obviously when we approach magnitude 2s, the OCC is closely watching the activity. They might actually proactively go and reach out to the operator and, you know, have some questions for them. But you know, from a sort of, you know, public perspective, you know, we don't, at the OGS, we don't really work on that, just because we don't have the sort of detailed information in order to sort of make a more detailed study of which completion operations produce seismicity and which are the best practices. I hear anecdotally, and Sean, feel free to jump in, but I hear anecdotally that a lot of operators will choose to reduce volumes or pressures. You can choose to skip certain stages. You might consult 3D seismic if available and already know about those problem areas. You might switch to gel or change the viscosity. I think there's a myriad number of different approaches that the operators are taking, but we don't really have the, oftentimes, at least historically, once it would hit 2.0, that's usually when we would actually detect it. So we, based on one earthquake occurring during a frac, we don't really have much, information or technical guidance we can lend to OCC to then pass on to the operator.
Yeah, I'd say, I think you're right, Jake. I think we, in my day job, we've tried all sorts of mitigation approaches as other operators have. And, what's difficult, I think, is to really determine, you don't have that control case of what would have happened if you didn't change something. So it's often difficult to establish the effectiveness of any given change. All the aspects you mentioned are things we've tried, and we're trying to more statistically test the effectiveness of those mitigations. Not, I can say across the board at Ovintiv, we work in different reservoirs with induced seismicity. But we also find pauses work really well. Just giving once you've activated the fault, giving it time to relax, as well as a chance to see how the seismic sequence is going to play out. So it's always my approach. When in doubt, pause.
And I appreciate, I'm looking through the chat and see Jens Eric relayed that there was a magnitude 3.7 event. I think it's been since reviewed. That's we haven't had any magnitude 3.0 or greater earthquakes this year, I think, thus far in Oklahoma. So of course, it's fitting that I would be giving a talk talking about all the progress we're making, and then there'd be a probably widely felt event while I'm talking.
It's just underscoring the importance of what you're discussing, Jake.
Yeah, which is it's pretty ironic.
I thought you just planned that for us, Jake.
All right, go. You get a walkie-talkie. Is there?
You got a button right beside your computer.
I guess I can jump in and answer Doug's question. Yeah, we have, so we're in the process of combining the research network or some of the private array data in addition to which goes back to nanometrics contributions publicly in the north central Oklahoma, combined with some data we've gotten from other companies prior to my time at OGS, combined with some data that we're getting, monthly in the scoop stack areas, and our data, and we're applying EasyQuake, which is the program that I sort of highlighted. And so we are making efforts to sort of, come up with a complete sort of machine learning driven catalog for obviously asking some of these, I think, important questions that, we just sort of, at least in my talk, I sort of just genuflected to.
Sounds good. Doug, if you're on board, feel free to elaborate if you like.
Is there any other, I guess?
Thanks, Jake. I'm just curious about, there is that wealth of data out there, and obviously depth uncertainty is key, and there may be an opportunity to really address that with some of the additional data available.
Yep.
And on that note, Jake, I liked your work around the did you feel it and tying it into the instrumental ground motion observations. And it looked like your comparison was pretty sparse at close offset. So is there room for collaboration to maybe use some of the private networks to extend that close in observation, or is it, are we going to be too close with questionable observations on true ground motion?
Yeah, I mean, obviously when you get to more shaking, a lot of times the broadbands will go off scale. I think, it'd be close enough, but it'd be that's something that, you know, we plan to tackle with some of the data sets that we have compiled, but it's not something I have answers for immediately. You know, it would be interesting to have, you know, strong motion data. I don't know if that's been deployed through private, you know, arrays, but that would be of interest, I think, to a number of different entities.
And there's a lot of work being done in British Columbia through the BC Oil and Gas Commission to do exactly that, with
Okay.
purposeful deployment of ground motions close in to get that close offset ground motion.
Hey, it's Stu here, Jake, just on that from the OGC in BC. And on that point, I guess we since like 2016 have required the deployment of strong motion sensors within 5 kilometers of hydraulic fracturing operations. And I'll share some of that data with you maybe later if you're interested, but some of the key observations we got off that is that they tend to register pretty high PGAs so that people feel that, and then it increases their kind of MMI sense, right? So you end up both on a qualitative, and then you can quantify it with the strong motion sensor to show that it's like a MMI 4 or 5 and sometimes approaching a 6. But then when you take the PGV, which is more kind of relatable to how the structure might be impacted, the PGV doesn't tend to register anywhere above a 4. So and for us, it's that duration piece. So people feel it and they feel like, my God, my house is going to fall over. And then when you pull the data, you go, yeah, okay, the PGA shows they would feel that quite strongly, but the PGV shows that the structure wouldn't sustain anything. So I'm interested in your other talk that your colleague gave about the duration and everything, because we see very short durations, and the strong motion sensors have been really key to sort of showing that, yes, in fact, somebody would feel this quite strongly, but the risk factor for damage is actually quite low. And because we get data that doesn't get, like you said, it doesn't get cut off, we get a full range, we can show that quite definitively. And it's been a really helpful set of data for assessing the risk through the area.
That sounds like we're approaching the same kind of questions with different angles. So I'll definitely get in touch with you, because I'd be interested to see that.
Thanks for that, Stu.
Jake, I have a question about the domain of influence that you consider around the hydraulic fracture. So you mentioned that there is some radius that you consider around the hydraulic fracture to associate it to a specific earthquake. But how about the Cascadian effect of putting a lot of hydraulic fracture simulations in a closed area? You showed in the map that you have a dense area of hydraulic fractures. So this fluid injection can reach to the neighbor hydraulic fracture, and then the earthquake can happen in farther distance to the hydraulic fracture that's happening at a specific location. So I've heard that this communication in some cases can reach to a long distance compared to the zone that you consider.
Yeah, that's an interesting sort of question that you're posing. Obviously, there's certain areas of where there's been completions where, you know, we see it's much more seismically active than other areas. So there's not really a tried and true, like, oh, you put this much volume, you know, over this many stages at these pressures, and you're going to produce, you know, this type of seismicity. It seems like there's focused areas where we observe more seismicity associated with hydraulic fracturing, which is intriguing geologically. And then what you sort of pointed out is, yeah, obviously, and we've actually seen this effect where I don't have it easily accessible right now on my computer, but we have observed where there's an adjacent, I think I pointed it out in the slide, but there's an adjacent lateral that's completing, and it's actually producing seismicity in an area where we've already seen HF associated activity. So that's an interesting sort of, you know, dynamic triggering effect, or pressure triggering. But, you know, for the discussion about the thresholding that we apply, that was just trying to get at a sort of simple decision about which earthquakes we're most confident in saying are associated with hydraulic fracturing, and using that as a sort of data set that we want to learn more about. So it's not meant to be a sort of a legal sort of definition of this is truly HF associated, or a regulatory decision. The regulator makes their own decisions about that spatial and temporal association. That's just for the purposes of trying to identify which data we're interested in further examining. And then obviously also the Poissonian test is also trying to get at, well, which earthquakes are truly triggered. And obviously in all those cases, you're going to have some earthquakes that are probably associated with hydraulic fracturing that are falling out of those thresholds, but you're probably identifying, and you're going to find some false positives as well within your spatial and temporal associations. But those are the ones you're most confident in, I think.
Yeah, thanks.
And I think Gail Atkinson's group has sort of actually put some more, put a number on it, so you can assign some confidence value in your spatial temporal association if you'd like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Hey, Jake, on a slightly different topic, you kind of alluded to interacting with the public and other stakeholders, and there's a lot of fantastic science here and continues to expand. Do you have comments in terms of just the interaction, particularly with the public, ability to really kind of understand the details that you've laid out here? And do you feel a change in the public sentiment towards new seismicity in your engagements?
That's that. Well, yeah, the public's happy that it's declined. I'll say that in general, which is a good thing. So not being in the news, obviously, I think that there's, what transpired in Oklahoma is sort of unprecedented, and I think it was happening so fast. The science was happening so fast, and the the approach to trying to understand it and disseminate as much information as was possible, I think was difficult to sort of keep up with what the science was dictating. The regulators, meanwhile, were trying to have effective strategies that were science proven, but in some ways that the academic timeline was not keeping up with sort of some of the decisions that were being made. So I think, and this is obviously I wasn't here, I was a research scientist at UT Austin at the time, so I can't really speak to having all the relevant details, but I think there needs to be some sort of continued improvement in science communication, and I don't think that's just within induced seismicity, but this is an interesting entanglement of the public safety, science communication, and how academics sort of advertise their new findings and their new work. So I don't know the answer, but I think having especially if these things are occurring in other regions and other countries, it would be good to have some sort of local dialogue with the people who are going to be impacted, whether that's the regulators or the state agencies that are involved in the monitoring or these types of things. I think maintaining those local collaborations is important. I haven't really followed the what's transpired in Korea and China, but I hope that as they're experiencing these larger events, that there is some sort of local dialogue and some sort of preparation for these studies coming out, because they do have rather than being the splashy headlines, they do have impacts, and people have to sort of respond to then the press inquiries. So if there could be improvement along those lines, and even sort of breaking it down for some of those groups, that'd be good.
So on a similar note, what about, so you nicely illustrated the improvements in the monitoring and the processing that you've put out, which watching this on kind of a daily and sometimes an hourly basis in my day job, it's impressive how the improvements in terms of robustness, speed, and sensitivity that you're getting out of the public network. But any issues with the public seeing just the number of reported events going up as you've improved the magnitude of completeness, for instance, reduce the magnitude of completeness?
Yeah, I think we had a lot of inquiries. Well, there's a certain contingent of, I guess the only other way to describe them are like activists who would reach out to public officials and say, you know, that, oh, you know, the number of earthquakes are increasing, you know, look at this. And then, you know, those public officials will then come back to us and, you know, obviously, you know, most of them have been briefed already about, you know, what we're doing and the improvements that we have. I mean, one of the things that we've, I guess might be relevant for other entities is we do meet monthly with the sort of governor's cabinet member, who's the Secretary of Energy and the Environment. And this is a meeting where Oklahoma Corporation Commission, Department of Environmental Quality, OGS, and several Oklahoma Water Resources Board, several agencies who deal with wastewater disposal and seismicity issues. We're all talking in the same room monthly. So they're aware and they're abreast of all that information. We try to keep, you know, maintain ties with the local media, because oftentimes an easy story is, oh, a magnitude 3.5 occurred here. And, you know, we try to sort of brief them on the science of seismicity, maintain relationships so that, you know, they're calling us as sort of trusted advisors on what's transpiring. But the whole media landscape, I mean, you know, pretty much everybody I've, you know, built a relationship with has sort of, you know, moved on to other pastures in the media landscape. So it's hard to sort of, you know, maintain those sort of trusted relationships with that, which is mostly, you know, how people are getting their news. You know, we probably could do better with our sort of, you know, announcing all the good stuff that we do at the OGS through, you know, social media, but we just don't have, you know, the people to really chase that as well. I think it's a difficult, you know, how people understand and perceive how science is done is very difficult and sort of speaks to the science communication piece. I think, you know, people are used to hearing about science like, oh, the study came out, and it's all framed as sort of like a scientist, you know, whiling away at their keyboard and having, you know, a eureka moment, which obviously everybody here understands that's not exactly what happens, right? You know, so it's a long, painstaking process, and, you know, involves collaborating and communicating with each other, and, you know, people just don't really understand that. So I don't know if I answered your question or just went on a long diatribe about my complaints with society. Oh, but yeah, no, speaking
Yeah.
the magnitude issue, yeah, we haven't really had many inquiries except when that transition does happen. So like, you know, within a few months, people will, you know, people who are tuned in will notice. But what I found is that as long as people are not feeling the earthquakes, they're not as sort of tuned into our products and, you know, what we're presenting out there in the world. It's like if you reduce that collective anxiety about a damaging earthquake being imminent, then you have less questions about why are there dots all over the state. Well, we've just gotten better at, you know, finding the earthquakes that we didn't know about before.
Great. Well, unless anybody has any other questions they want to ask, I think we've taken up a lot of Jake's time here.
So there is one question about a specific downhole tool that function to help answer any of these questions. So I think this question refers to pressure transducers that you can put at the downhole and monitor the reservoir pressure. For example, for water disposal, you want to see how much the reservoir pressure rises during decades of injection in order to isolate the effect of that. So is there any pressure monitoring that in the downhole?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I'm not familiar with the sort of technology available during a hydraulic fracture. The OGS, Kyle Murray at the OGS has put pressure transducers into Arbuckle wells across a lot of Oklahoma, and those results are forthcoming. I know that Andy Barber at USGS has done a similar type of analysis with a well in Osage County, and find, they have some interesting insights about the Arbuckle as a, from a hydrogeology perspective. Obviously, we'd like to know about, strain and stress in the subsurface, but, it's prohibitively expensive to instrument those for a long period of time. But, yeah, I don't really have something on the tip of my tongue that would be, relevant.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks.
Well, why don't we take this this lull to thank you again, Jake, and I guess we can go ahead and wrap it up. And I really appreciate the really interesting presentation. Well done.
Yep.
Hey,
Thanks again for having me. Thanks,
Jake,
everyone.
thank you so much. At some point during the presentation, the participant number was 94. So there were a lot of people in your talk.
All right, great.
Great.
Thanks.
Congrats. Yeah. Great
You're a
work.
rock star, man.
Yeah,
See you guys.
exactly. Yeah.
All right, have a good day, everyone.
Thank you. I will send you the chat messages and the recording. The recording will be uploaded very soon after the processing. It takes like a few hours to process, and I upload it on YouTube channel. Thank you, everyone.
Great, thanks, Marty.
Thank you so much, Sean. Great webinar. Thank you.